So hi, I'm Steve. I do web-based stuff. No one really cares about what other job I do, so I'm just going to move on. So I'm here tonight to talk about ES6, or JavaScript 2015, as it's also known, because in the JavaScript community we can't have one name for something. What is ES6? Well, it's a bit interesting because people say it's the next generation of JavaScript, but actually it's the current generation of JavaScript. It's been ratified, it's now a standard, it's just nobody's implemented it yet. In fact, people are, as we speak, working on ES7 and apparently bits of ES8, because let's look ahead on these things. And ES6 is kind of interesting because there's very little in it that's actually new. And most features in ES6 you could implement as code in ES5. There's a lot of focus on, well, let's take things that people are implementing in common patterns, and let's just make it part of the language to make it easier to use and easier to consume. There's some new functionality, but we'll see later. But an awful lot of it is just that way. So we're just going to go through the features one by one. So we're going to start with the modules. So, hands up, who here uses JavaScript modules, be it CommonJS or MD or less than that, actually. So, for those who don't use modules, basically, a module in JavaScript means you can separate your code out. So this JavaScript lives in this file, this JavaScript lives in this file, so we don't have a 2 meg JavaScript file and anything in it. And there's two main ways of doing modules at the moment, one of which is called CommonJS. And this is, you can use on the front end by using the CommonJS JavaScript library, or you can, this is Node's module format as well, which is where I first came across it. And it's pretty straightforward. So in a file, you just say, well, okay, I've got some random functions here, and I just say module exports these two functions. And then in another file, when I want to use it, I can just require that file. And then on A here, I have an a.foo and a.bar that points to these functions. Pretty straightforward, easy to do. There's another module format as well called AMD, which I haven't put up here because its syntax is a lot more complicated. But it has a number of advantages, which is you can genuinely asynchronously load a module, so you don't need to put everything in one file at the end. You can actually go away and require something over the network and it will work. You can also use it for advanced concepts like sandboxing, which CommonJS doesn't support. Now, ES6 has introduced its own module functionality, which in terms of syntax is actually pretty similar to CommonJS. It's a little bit different. So you see we now have this handy export keyword that we can put directly on either functions or variables. And we can then import this way from a file in the same way. But because it's supported by the language, there is also functionality to do that asynchronous loading and sandboxing. So we've got the simplicity of CommonJS with all the power of AMD.js, which is sort of a big win. The next feature is classes. Again, we can fake classes in JavaScript. We can use sort of functions as classes and have sub-functions and various other things, and we can do inheritance by setting prototypes and things like this. But it's a lot easier to just have a first class class, I guess. And you can see here, we've got a new class called Polygon. We have the notion of constructors, which is great. We're setting some properties, and we have some functions. And then if we want to do inheritance, well, we can just say, well, this extends this. And we can call the base constructor by just using super. We can explicitly call the base by using super at any point. It's very similar to how classes work in any other language. There are a few downsides. So there's no support for any private methods because we don't have the concept of sort of access modifiers. So there is no public, private, and protected. But it turns out with methods we can kind of fake private methods, and I'll show you how in a second. And there's no support for private variables, but there is a spec on that in ES7. We'll see that later. So how do we fake a private method? Well, what we can do is in our module, we can have our class, and then we can have another function that's in the module. And because the class is in the module, the class can call the function. But nothing else can call that function because it's embedded in the module rather than the class. It's not exported. If you want to be really evil and you say, well, I want to operate on this class, then you can sort of pass the class through with this, and it all gets a bit bizarre. So you can do it. It's not pleasant. I'm hoping I'll improve that. Next new feature, arrow functions, which looks really stupid, but is my favourite new feature in ES6. And just for shits and giggles, I've managed to reverse the example. So ES5 is on the bottom here. So this is fairly straightforward. It's just iterating through an array, and the for each takes a function. So this would just log out everything in the array. My equivalent in ES6 here is using an arrow function. And really, that's just the same. It's just saying there's a function, and it does this work. The great thing about this is, ironically, who's had to mess around with the value of this in JavaScript? Sort of var self equal this at some point. Yeah, it's a mess, and it's because JavaScript is function scoped. So think about that as being in a giant function. So in here, if I was operating on this would point to my function, which isn't that useful. Pretty much never do I want to point to that. An arrow function does not rescope this. So this is still pointing to the containing function, which is actually really useful and really tidy code. Talking about function scoping, let and const. So I like this, it's really straightforward. So this is one of these problems where if it's never been an issue, it's probably never even occurred to you. But because everything's function scoped in JavaScript, if I run this ES5 code, A exists down here outside of my if. Because we're not block scoped, we're function scoped. Which can be a real problem if you sort of write code that reuses names inside like sub-references. You can end up with a problem. So let is exactly the same as var, but it's block scoped rather than function scoped. And that's the only difference. So in this particular case, if I ran this, A would come back as undefined because it's outside of the block. And basically, let variables work the same way as variables in pretty much every other language on the planet. The only other one is const, which is exactly the same as let, but it's a constant. So once you've assigned something to it, you can't assign a new value to it. Default parameters. These are one of those things, really stupid little feature, but it saves so much time. So now, in my function declarations, I can now say, if I pass through A as 5, then my value is 5. But if I don't pass anything, it's 1. Yeah. Again, you can work around in ES5, you know, you'd have to do is A value, or it. Template strings. This is just about string interpolation. So I need to mix strings and variables, and I get to concatenate everything together in JavaScript in a hilarious fashion. But with templating, I can just say $bracket, and I can interpolate in. The nice thing is it gets to use a brand new sort of quote, a back quote, because what JavaScript was lacking was quotes. It's going to be especially funny if you've got a font where the back quote looks approximately the same. And there's lots of other functions as well. I mean, this talk's too long to go into all of them, but promises. Who here has used promises in JavaScript? Some people, fantastic. Well, basically, for those who haven't, a promise is a way of saying this is going to do something later. That's a really bad explanation. But basically, rather than using a callback, if you return a promise, you can then consume that promise and say, do this, then do this. And most things use what's called the promise, the A+ promise spec. There's a pretty good standard there. And the built-in ES6 promises also implement the A+ promise spec, so ES6 promises should work with any promise library that you're currently using. Again, it's about getting all these different implementations saying, there's one. Sets and maps are just new collections. It's not that interesting. Proxies are kind of interesting in that you can set a proxy on a method, so you can sort of run an intercept on this method. So when you call this method, call my proxy first. You could write some really evil code in JavaScript using proxies, but I can see it being quite useful for testing. And there's simple things like the math object gets some new functions like is not a number, is integer, and some constants like pi and various other things. A lot of these I look at and go, what do you mean that wasn't in there previously? And then I realise how much I use Lodash and underscore. Array gets from, which means I can make an array from another array or a collection of arrays. Find and find index, which lets us just find values in it. Strings gets contains. How was that not in the string library previously? I sort of looked at that and went, that's a, what? Binary and octal literal handling, which again, if you don't have anything to do with them, you don't care, but I do, so it's actually quite good. Generators in yield could be an hour-long conversation all by itself. For those who've used other languages with yielding, it works exactly the same as that. It's basically a way of doing very memory-efficient iteration over a collection. And destructuring and spread operators, which again are another huge talk, but it's basically about breaking objects apart and selecting subelements and reconstructing them. So, how do we get to use this right now? Because the problem is nothing supports ES6, or some supports bits and not others. Some sort of works but doesn't work according to the spec, it's all a bit of a mess. Well, what we need is a transpiler. So a compiler is something that takes code and outputs an executable. A transpiler is something that takes code in language A and outputs something in code in language B. Now, because all the ES6 features, as I said, could be written in ES5, that's exactly what Babel.js is. It takes your ES6, and then it outputs enough ES5 to make that all work. It was also written by a 14-year-old kid, just to make us all feel insecure. Let's start with an easy example, though. Let's do this server-side. And I'm a node programmer. So if you're using Node 4, which was released a couple of weeks ago, most of ES6 is implemented in it, apart from the module system. So if you wanted to use it natively, you can still use Node modules and it will kind of work. Don't bother with Node 4, it's a mess. But if you really want to use Babel, want to use all the features inside Node, then you just need to install Babel and then hook into require. So make your first require be Babel register, and from there anything you require is run through Babel first, and it just goes. But server side is easy. Let's do client side. Client side is hard. So we've got two problems. We've got ES6, which we need to transform to ES5, which we can do with Babel, but we've still got modules on the other side. We've still got common.js module. So we need to stitch those modules together into one big file that can just be consumed as JavaScript. So we go ES6.5 Babel to ES5 modules, and then we use either Webpack or Browserify to take those ES5 modules and give us one huge chunk of JavaScript. I'm going to give a brief example of using Webpack. Don't worry, I'll be going through this in more detail in a minute. But actually, what tends to happen is for both Browserify and Webpack, you can use Babel as a plugin into them, rather than having this. You could set it up as two separate stages, but it's just easier to say, I have a Babel plugin for this. So in this particular case, it's saying, well, okay, I'm coming into main.js. I want to output a bundle.js in the public directory, and anything you see called with a JS extension, excepting the modules, running through the Babel loader, which will transform it from ES6 to ES5. So that does ES6 to ES5, and then Webpack puts it all together into one big chunk of JavaScript. And just to show you that, let's see. If you haven't got mirroring on, you can't actually see anything. And I'm not actually doing it into the directory. Get in. Right. Well, this is exactly what you saw before. It's just a more concrete example. So if you have a look at my main.js, I'll just try and zoom this up a little bit. This is basically that class example you saw before. It's just some classes with some properties on it. And I've got a gulp file here. And all this gulp file is doing is running through that Webpack transform from before. So now, if I run gulp, then you should get build a bundle. And we can see, okay, well we've got a little bit of Webpack code at the top. It's not much. It stops about there, so it's a couple of lines. But then we start to see our transformed code. So what has it done? Okay, well our class has been transformed into a function with nested functions. That makes sense. And our let that was down at the bottom just gets transformed into a var, which again makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we no longer have the advantages of using, say, let, but what we should be doing is linting our ES6 to make sure that we have the advantages at that point. And things like ESLint have great support for ES6 now. In terms of people using this, there's pretty much everything is going ES6. I mean, if you look at Angular 2 with its dependence on its sort of TypeScript variant is actually ES6 based. React is moving to ES6 slowly but surely, and more systems are using ES6 by default and using Babel to help them with it. Indeed, the React transformer that used to take various things and transform React JSX back to JavaScript is now Babel as well. Because Babel isn't just limited to ES6. It used to be called 65 for obvious reasons, but then they moved beyond doing ES6. So they now handle JSX, and indeed they've started doing ES7. And there's all sorts of interesting bits in ES7, so who here has used a bit of C#? So async await in C# now exists in ES7 and works exactly the same way. So basically, rather than dealing with a promise directly, you can await a promise in an asynchronous function and it will just work as if it was synchronous. And that's pretty much it for this talk. I mean, that's the thing, it's very straightforward, this process. Oh, there's one thing, I guess. There's another interesting side effect of all this being done in Babel, which is traditionally, and certainly with the evolution of ES6 at the beginning, the specs sort of get written pretty much behind closed doors. I mean, they're not actual closed doors, but not many people are involved in the specification process. But with things like Babel, sort of taking those features before they're even sort of formally signed off and implementing them, developers get to use them and feed back on them. And certainly in ES6, the class, the module specification changed substantially between versions due to feedback from developers. And this sort of preliminary implementation using Babel and having people play with it is actually making JavaScript a better language because we're feeding back as devs much earlier in the process. And that's a cool process, I think. I think it's going to make JavaScript generally better. But that's pretty much it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to either hit me up on Twitter or come and talk to me or ask now, which would be even better, or see me in the past. Does anybody have any questions now? Yes?
It's more, I guess it's a question, but does the class keyword and syntax worry slightly in the fact that it kind of isolates JavaScript and uses it? It's more accessible to language, but people don't necessarily want to understand language as much as they do.
It's a fair point.
So it's just sugar for prototypes?
Yeah, others doing the same thing.
Yeah. I mean, the important thing to point out is that ES6 isn't taking your ES5 away.
Yeah, no, I totally understand that, but people will automatically, especially if you're going to use JavaScript,
but that problem exists elsewhere anyway already. If someone's got to come from another language and try and make JavaScript look like their existing language, they've got to do it whether or not there's a class.
That's how class kind of strikes me when someone uses JavaScript for it kind of strikes me as like, ooh, we look more appealing and more friendly now to say C# developers or Java developers.
I mean, certainly I can think of one internal project I can think of where in their linter settings it flags class up, just says no. But that's entirely up to you, and it doesn't preclude all the other features of ES6. I mean, the nice thing is if you want to factor it out, then do it so in linter settings to tell people to fuck off.
I would probably use class because it's tidy.
Yeah.
It concerns me for future developers if you might not learn the language. That's if you
yeah. I can see the concerns. You're not taking my class away. Anybody else? Yes?
I don't know how much sort of ES6 have you written in projects at the moment, and you start coming across any downsides of the
quite a bit in no. Is the answer. The only thing that is a sort of gotcha is when you're writing NPM modules, and it's more something you have to be aware of. We've had people inside the company write ES6 modules, which is fine, I have no problem with it. But they are actually just exporting the ES6 directly, and they were using the require hook inside library, which is all sorts of no, because if you hook that in library, you've just hooked it for my entire project. So if you're going to write a library with this, then what you need to do is do a proper build step that dumps it all out to ES5, and that's what gets put on npm. That's the only real downside of it.
Have you stopped using var, and do you use net or cost?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, my standard ES settings we don't allow var because there's no downside.
Do you prefer using like letters as the new var?
Yeah, effectively, I just use it instead. I just need to remember where the 3 other keys are. That's the only real difference. Because, I mean, I came from another language originally, so I always think block scope. So it's less dangerous for me anyway. Anybody else? Yes.
You think this kills CoffeeScript?
Yes, dead. And I'm glad. But if I could take CoffeeScript outside and give it a kicking in the corner, I would do it. Anyone else?
Yeah. Would you recommend learning TypeScript?
TypeScript is an interesting one, especially with the emergence of like 1.5. It used to be really fraught because TypeScript prior to 1.5 was based on an older ES6 spec. So it was actually a real problem if someone learned TypeScript because they were learning the wrong spec. Luckily, they sort of updated it to the final ES6 spec. So now I just think of TypeScript as ES6 plus static typing. I've used TypeScript for stuff. I've used Flow instead to do static typing, and I kind of prefer Flow just for some odd reasons. But if you're learning TypeScript, you're really now learning ES6 as well.
Yeah, well, obviously, like it's kind of ahead of the curve because I think they're going to start introducing things like decorators and stuff like that, which are proposed to the ES7. So
yeah.
Would you recommend learning that to keep up if you want the leading edge?
Well, I use ES7 features now. Certainly in the React stuff I've been writing, I use a lot of attributes and decorators. But I'm very aware of the fact that that spec isn't signed off, so it could just die at some point. But ultimately, I could just use the same version of Babel and still want to transform the code the same way. Yeah.
Are there any features in Babel that you're not yet using in production that need shifts?
I don't think we're using the ES7 features in production. I'm using it on personal projects, but I don't think we're using it anyway. There's quite a nice sort of safety level in Babel. By default, it will just be the ES6 features, and you have to explicitly turn on the other features. So we're just going with the standards at the moment. There is certainly still some catch-up in tooling, like as I said, ESLint does support ES6, but you need to use a plugin for Babel to do so, and it would be nice if they would support it natively. And there's no real reason not to. But compatibility is only going to improve over time. Okay.